Well, good evening. Welcome to our discussion on what is imagination. My name is Dr. Eric Beery, and I'm the director of the Arthur C Clarke Center for Human Imagination. And tonight I get to unpack that whole long phrase, which is really kind of fun and exciting for me. I'm a physician at UCSD, as well as the director of our center, and I have a special interest in neurophysiology. And so have been invited to become the director for this new phase of the Clarke Center for our next 5-year term, starting in 2020. How can this be 2020? What happened? I can't even remember 2010, you know? So it's kind of stunning to be here and be the director of our center. First, I'd like to start off by saying thanks to our sponsors. Our long-term sponsors of the Clarke Center have been the Viasat Corporation and the Taubman Foundation. And we have new sponsors, including the Nokia Bell Labs and our special colleague Eric Redeman, who's in the audience with us, and other private donors, and of course the support of the university through all our various departments, our home department in physical sciences, and my home department in medicine and engineering and social sciences, and across the campus. And that's a little bit of the theme that I want to bring. So as I said, what I'd like to do is unpack the Arthur C Clarke Center for Human Imagination. So let's start by asking, who was Arthur C Clarke? So audience participation poll, who knows who Arthur C Clarke was out there? Okay, so kind of 50-50. That's usually the way it is. So it's either, oh, Arthur C Clarke, or it's who's Arthur C Clarke, right? Well, so Arthur C Clarke is our inspiration. Our name comes from the Arthur C Clarke Foundation. And Clarke was a personal icon for me in the 20th century, as he was for many millions of people. He was an amazing man, a physicist, and a gravity technologist. And what we see in our picture here is the geosynchronous satellite orbit. So a special orbit around the Earth where a satellite will stay in position over a single spot on the Earth, sometimes called a Clarke orbit. Arthur C. Clarke described this in an article in 1946. So Clarke worked in World War II, and in the 40s and 50s, with the opprobrium against homosexual men, probably experienced that somewhat himself. I wonder about that. So he left England at the same time that his contemporary Alan Turing was under the force of the British government, and Clarke toured around the world. He traveled with a man who was a scuba diver. And in the World War II, the aqualung, the self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, was invented by Jacques Cousteau. And Clarke was one of the first people to use it. And he said that he liked and wanted to explore underwater because it was the closest he would ever get to being weightless. Clarke, in his life, experienced polio. That's why he was in a wheelchair for a good part of his life. And in fact, I had the great opportunity to meet him personally in Sri Lanka in 2002 in his home when he was in a wheelchair. But despite that, he was just an incredible enthusiast. So as I said, he was a technologist who invented gravity technologies like the geosynchronous orbit and the space elevator. And he was a science communicator. And in fact, also a noted science fiction writer, most noted for the screenplay for the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, which he wrote with Stanley Kubrick in the 1960s. However, for me, my touchstone for Clarke was this book called Profiles of the Future, which the first edition came in 1960, where he had all kinds of discussions about what possible things could occur in technology and scientific discoveries, and it's still a wonderful read. So I commend it to you. It's hard, especially harder now since I bought up a lot of the copies on ABE Books. But if you can find it, it's really neat. There's a Millennium Edition from the year 2000 where he had updated things. And one of our schemes at the Arthur C Clarke Center is to do a 21st century version of Profiles of the Future. Although I don't think we'll ever find anybody quite like Clarke himself, so we'll need a real cadre of people to put that together. So Clarke was, as I say, an amazing man, and our center, the Center for Human Imagination, comes from the Arthur C Clarke Foundation. And in our center, we cover a variety of themes, including the neuroscience of imagination, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight, space on cosmology through things like my co-director, Brian Keating, who's looking at the Big Bang and literally will look at it with his new telescope. And here at the Sanford Institute, we've had the ability to participate in space flights. I'm the principal investigator on our second mission to space, looking at brain stem cells flying into space with my great colleague Alison Matry, whose technology of brain organoids is the basis of our mission. And and Alison funded our first mission, and we are anxiously awaiting the results coming back from that flight this past summer. Another key thing that we do at the Clarke Center is science fiction and speculative culture, and we have the great privilege of being the host to the preeminent science fiction writers workshop in the world, the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop. It's been around for over 40 years, was started by such luminary science fiction writers as Harlan Ellison, and has had many, many great science fiction writers, award-winning writers, including my colleague, Dr. David Brin, and the audience here, who's been an instructor and a participant in the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop. And we are super lucky to be able to host it here every summer, bringing nascent science fiction writers from around the world to develop their craft. Lastly, we have, but certainly not least, we do all kinds of work combining science and art and tools for imagination, which again is just really fun. And one of our newest sponsors is the Nokia Bell Labs, and that lab, that group, the famous Bell Labs from Murray Hill, is interested in art and technology, and that's something that they're bringing support to our center for. And they're also interested in empathy, and there's a little story around empathy that they'll tie into our work on imagination. So that's the Arthur C Clarke Center. Now we're the Center for Human Imagination, and as I've been telling my colleagues, we know we're a little bit cheeky that we're calling ourselves the Center for Human Imagination, since the whole friggin' UC San Diego is really about human imagination, and it's just a great privilege for us to be here. And so, as I said, we are interested in some of the mechanics of human imagination, what's going on in the brain. But as I said, I'm a physician, and so I take some personal inspiration around imagination from my patients. So I'm a specialist in the Neurological Institute here, where I see people with brain complicating, brain clouding symptoms, including ringing in the ears or tinnitus, dizziness and imbalance like vertigo, and headaches. And luckily, I don't see patients who die very frequently. I don't look after life-threatening conditions, but I do look after life occupation-threatening conditions. And the thing that comes to from patients to me is, I can't think. And so, of course, they can't imagine. And so that disruption of their thinking and imagination really is ruining many, many lives. And so it's incredibly gratifying when I can help people along that way. And sometimes it takes just as simple as a rudimentary thing as giving a little bit of the natural element magnesium in an oral form, and I can help them think better. So I take personal inspiration from my patients about disruption of their thinking, and use that understanding of the brain and the tools that we have here at UCSD, where I would say we have the greatest collection of brain examining technologies anywhere in the world, and incredible training and scientists and clinicians on brain science and brain diseases. So we're well poised in our place here at UC San Diego. And so I have to give full credit to my fantastic colleague, Patrick Coleman, who organized the event for us this evening, bringing together people from across the campus who exemplify the great power that we have at UC San Diego in studying imagination, doing research about it, and thinking deeply. And so what I want to do is we'll have our speakers come up and give a brief discussion of their ideas about imagination, and then we'll have a chance, as we switch over, you might be able to ask a question or two briefly of them. But then what we'll do is bring everybody up for a little bit of a panel discussion where, again, it'll be a little bit cheeky and ask them to answer some questions and maybe take some questions from the audience. However, I want to start by audience participation. So I always like audience participation in the things that I work on. So I want to invoke an active imagination. So I want you to imagine taking a picture of something in this room. It can be the screen, it could be me if you really want to. I want you to imagine a picture that you might take in this room. Okay, imagine that. Now what I want you to do is do everything that you really want, something that everybody really wants to do. All right, take your cell phone out of your pocket. Come on, take it out. Bring your cell phone. Take your cell phone out of your pocket. And take that picture that you imagined. And I'm going to take a picture of you because I was imagining you guys taking a picture. So I have this view. Oh, there, I see, this is brilliant. I was like, people with their cell phones by request out in the audience. So take the picture. You can use the flash if you like, I don't care. Go for it. Take a picture. All right. So here's the thing. I've had the great privilege of going around asking people about their imagination and what they imagine. And what I'm curious about and what we'll be using in our laboratory in the Clarke Center is what those imaginings are like, and for visual imaginings. And unfortunately, I can't ask you all right now, but when you come to our lab, we'll be asking you these questions. And in fact, asking you to imagine things like taking a picture and then comparing that imagining to what you have in your mind. And so I'll give you the shortcut to the answer. So it's interesting. So for me, when I imagine things, what I see in my mind is kind of, sort of like what I see through my visual consciousness, but it's never as bright and as vivid or as high resolution as, and that seems to be what a lot of people experience. They see something, but it's not really like what you see in real time in the world. Now, a fair number of people, and many of the amazing people that I see and talk and ask this question, they have what I would say eidetic imagination. They see in their mind the same as they see in the real world, which is kind of stunning to me. It's kind of a stunning idea that you could see what in your mind, that picture or an object like an apple, at the same level as what you would see in the real world. That's just kind of a stunning thing to me, but a lot of people do. Here's the even more stunning thing to me. Some people have no visual imagination. They have nothing that they see in their mind. And in fact, there's a name for this. It's called aphantasia. And here's the cool part about it. To me, and I was talking about this once, and oh, that would be pretty lousy. Wouldn't that be sort of a deficit? Wouldn't that be a thing missing in your life if you couldn't imagine things visually? And it turns out people can, with aphantasia, can do all kinds of amazing things. I met a PhD physicist at the Bell Labs, and where I've been talking about this, and he came up and said, I'm one of your people who just doesn't, and so what do you see? I don't see anything. And yet this man had gone on and invented incredible prize-winning technologies, ironically, about the visual system. Another person who's talked publicly about aphantasia, about his experience of not seeing anything, is J. Craig Venter, the first person to lead the team, the leader of the first team to decode the human genome. J. Craig Venter just down the road. And he's talked about this, how he doesn't see anything. Now, of course, if you know the process that they use to decode the genome, where they cut the genome up and then they put it in little pieces and match the pieces all up to then put the whole thing back together, it was an algorithm, it was a mathematical process, it was a programming process. And so I haven't had a chance to talk to Venter about it, but my suspicion is that somehow he thinks in algorithms. I think he thinks not in visual images, like imagining taking a picture, but he sees algorithms and he puts those pieces together, and being a great leader, he had a huge team and was able to decode the genome, ironically his own genome, for the first time in human history. So there's an amazing variation in what our imagined abilities are about. So with that, I'm going to start with my colleague Leanne Chikoski, who is a vision perception expert and eye movements expert, trained here at the Salk Institute, and now is, I'm so fortunate to have her as my colleague at the Qualcomm Institute here at UCSD. And we'll have her talk a little bit about visual imagination and imagination from her perspective. Leanne.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you all for attending. I'm super excited to get to work with Eric because it takes me back to my roots as a neuroscientist studying my PhD at NYU, where I actually had the chance to understand and look at the neural underpinnings of visual motion perception. And I haven't had a chance to do that since, actually, so I make video games that you play with your eyes. That seems like a shift, right? So I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got here, because there's a little bit of the story to why I'm particularly fascinated by visual imagination. About 8 years ago, my colleague Jean Townsend, another neuroscientist, and I met up because I was leaving a position at the foundation Autism Speaks. I was a program officer for several years, and I decided that I really wanted to come back to research full-time. I was sick of helping people fund their ideas, and I was ready to get mine funded and, and make some change in the world. And I was particularly interested in finding ways to create novel interventions. And so I found this colleague, Jean Townsend, who is a brilliant neuroscientist who had an excellent view of the broad construct of attention and had a really great eye tracker, and that was important too. So together, we came up with this idea that the construct of attention has a lot of ties to eye movements, and that was part of my expertise as a graduate student and a postdoc at the Salk Institute. I studied saccadic and smooth pursuit eye movements. Saccadic eye movements are the ones you make 3 to 4 times a second. You're not aware of that, fortunately, but I can make you very aware of your eye movements by asking you to use them to drive a video game. Okay? If you've never had to focus on something like that multiple times a second, it's draining. But it also happens to be a very good way to train aspects of this broad construct of attention. So we had a small clinical trial funded by NIH that allowed us to test whether children on the autism spectrum that had a very well-defined difference in orienting behavior, so slow and inaccurate orienting, if it could be improved by that, and we showed that it did. Fast forward a few years, and my position moves to the Qualcomm Institute, and I'm sorry for the change in slides, but I really wanted to show these two things. I was given an opportunity to found a center, the Power of Neurogaming Center at the Qualcomm Institute, because as we made these video games that you play with your eyes, I had a number of other people come to me and say, wow, I have a good idea for a game. I'd like to make a game for an intervention or a game for assessment. And we had gone on to make many other games. I'll tell you about a few of those. But there was no mechanism to do that. And so we started a center where we actually take a lot of young people, both students and recent graduates who are visual artists. They are coders themselves, or they just have really great ideas about sound in video games or the narrative of video games, or there are project managers, and they come together and they actually make these games. And we basically take in clients from our colleagues who want to have games made. Fantastic experience for young people. I presented this model, if you will, at a conference, and I got challenged to do something which will be the end of this, it will reveal at the end of the story. So you know what? This ecosystem of learning around video games that you've created, that's really great. You should do it for people on the autism spectrum, because you are talking about the fact that there are other challenges in their life. They're not necessarily getting jobs, but yet they have these brilliant creative streaks that you yourself have seen. And I did indeed, while I was doing this intervention, going into their homes, because this is a video game that you play at home over the course of 8 weeks. I saw the art, I saw the video games they themselves created, the stories that they wrote, the music they were writing, but it was stuck in their home. Another side to that story is that the people who were playing these games were super enthusiastic and wanted to keep them. Now, I'm a scientist, and I live by grants, and the grant was ending. There was no way to say, well, yes, go ahead and keep that machine and I'll fix it up for you every 6 months. Not gonna happen. We don't have that kind of resources. However, the university helped us to create a small company. So that is what Brainleap Technologies is. It's a small startup here in San Diego. And although we are pursuing an FDA approval path right now, we've decided that the best thing we could possibly do is to get it in the hands of people, get it into schools. And it was an eye-opening experience to me, because the construct of attention is very, very broad. And although we designed these games specifically to improve orienting behavior, they also improve focus. And those of you who are familiar with ADHD, children who have ADHD have a problem with focus. Obviously, if I have a game that you play with your eyes, I can create aspects of that to make you focus. And there are aspects embedded in our games. And so this became a really interesting opportunity too, because now I don't have to have, so sort of expanding these ideas, that I don't have to have somebody label a kid with a disorder. There's a set of games in a school. If you have some sort of challenge with attention, or you just want to try them out, maybe you don't know what it means to focus, this will show you, right? So it's pretty cool. It's a great opportunity. It feels really good to actually create something that's out in the world. But I'm most happy to tell you about the thing that just got funded. I'm very, very pleased, and maybe some of you have seen, there was a press release from the Qualcomm Institute. The fortunate recipient of a 4-year NSF funded grant from the Future of Work programs, $2.6 million, to continue a internship program that I started in 2018 for young adults on the autism spectrum, precisely because we can create an ecosystem of learning around video games. This was initially funded by the Legler-Benbow Institute, as well as the San Diego Foundation. And this is some pictures from our showcase event at the end of the summer in 2018. But this completely changed the way I think about creativity at work and imagination. We had 25 young adults that span the range of people just out of high school, all the way to people in their mid-30s, working together in teams of 5 with coaches that were just undergraduates or recent graduates who just had some empathy and were willing to help out and encourage. And each of these teams created a sensor-enabled game from scratch and displayed it, demoed it. This was you can't see the rest of the room, but it's packed with over 100 people. And they came to cheer, they came to play, and the people who were actively job seeking 6 months out, 85% of them had jobs. So this is something that can actually work. Well, in order to get this funding from NSF, we're also creating technology. We're creating AR technology to help support people coach basically speaking and orienting skills when we don't have a human coach there. But I'm much more interested in thinking about how we capture in our workplace the creativity, differences in thought that occurred in those groups. Out of the 5 games that were designed that summer, 2 of them are actively part of our research right now. Okay, this is 8 weeks. People who are not trained in science at all created something that was actually useful in science. I mean, this is fantastic. So how can we leverage that creativity? How can we leverage the imagination of people who think a little differently, who are trained a little differently, their lived experience is different, and come together to create something that's more than any one of us can do on our own? And that's why I'm super excited to be here. And thank you, Eric.
Can you hear me? Are we on now? No. Hello.
It's the low tech.
Any questions for Dr. John?
Yeah.
Dr. Scott, have you used this with patients who are adults who have either experienced a stroke, traumatic brain injury, or autism? I mean, Alzheimer's?
Sorry. I don't
That's
know.
okay, I got it. My question is have you used this with adults or 20-somethings who've experienced traumatic brain injury, concussion, stroke, or Alzheimer's?
So thank you very much for that question. We've had a couple one-offs of people who've had traumatic brain injury. In fact, I don't know enough about it. We've talked about this as a potential next step. That's not my area of expertise, but you know, there's a question that's come to me multiple times, and so I've actually some people with TBI, some people, younger people with stroke. Some people on the autism spectrum were in their 20s when they were part of our trial, so it's not just something that works with kids. And to your point about older adults and Alzheimer's, we are moving toward mild cognitive impairment in maybe the very, very earliest stages of Alzheimer's. But right now, we have a National Institute of Aging grant to do this in older adults with the goal of not necessarily the orienting aspect of attention, but to suppress distraction, to reduce distractibility, which is a common problem in older adults. And those data look fantastic. So we've just gone through the first wave, and now the second wave is starting. So find me if you know anyone who's interested in participating, and it's going to, okay.
Tomorrow.
No, it's a really interesting way to think about protection, right? So can we train this way to protect? It's you know, I don't know yet that we have something that can protect from that cognitive decline, but I know that the pre-post improvement was extremely dramatic in the older adults that we did engage. So we're working on it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So carrying on, again, what I'm hoping we can show is the breadth of our capabilities at UCSD. So moving on to the Department of Cognitive Science, I'm super pleased to have my colleague, Dr. Lira join us. She's a specialist in the mind and the brain and how new ideas to come together. So I guess I really got to include her in our work on thinking about imagination. So with that, I'll have Lira come and talk to us from cognitive science.
Thank you so much for having me here. So we humans are physical things. Of course, we live in a physical world. We have these physical bodies. We receive physical information from the world, right? So right now, you're getting airwaves impinging on your eardrums, vibrating your eardrums. Your brain's converting that into neural signals, possibly creating thoughts as a result, hopefully. We get photons stuck in our eyeballs. We get pressure on our skin, and in return, we can act on the world. We bend our toes and flex our knees in order to defy gravity and move around, right? All this kind of basic physical stuff. And yet, out of this soup of physical interactions, we come out with incredibly abstract ideas about things that are unexperienceable through the physical senses, right? We talk about principles and goals. We talk about time travel, imaginary numbers. How do we come up with those things? How do we take this superphysical experience and end up with all of these lofty ideas that humans invent that go far beyond what we could ever physically experience? And in fact, those ideas, those abstract ideas, they aren't just things that, you know, once in a while in a lab, some lofty person thinks. They're the things that make being human fun, right? So if you go to a dinner party and the kind of conversation you can hold is, boy, this table, it's solid, wooden, brown, right? If those are the only kinds of things you can say about physical reality, you're not invited back to that dinner party, right? You're going to have to talk about other things, and those things are things that are not in the here and now, not about the basic physics of the world. So how do we come up with those things? Well, one of the things that I study is language. Language is this incredible tool of human creativity. So right now I'm using it to implant ideas in your mind, right? So I'm sending these pressure waves through the air. They're impinging on your eardrums, creating neural signals, creating ideas. And through this, I can implant all kinds of crazy ideas in your mind, right? So I can say, imagine two hedgehogs dancing on a pancake that's traveling backwards in time while someone plays the accordion, right? Now, if everything has gone relatively well in your life so far, you haven't had that thought before. It's a new thought that you just had. And you can do this infinitely, right? You can do this infinitely. In fact, we do this infinitely, maybe not with such bizarre images, but so many of the sentences that people here have already uttered today are sentences you have never heard before. And as you walk out of here, you will also say lots and lots of sentences you've never said or heard before. So language, because it allows us to take a finite set of elements and recombine them in all kinds of new ways, is this infinite engine of creativity, right? It allows us to generate new and new ideas. You put two things together and sometimes you say, hey, wait a second, how do you get a pancake to fly? And then you start a lab and you get funding and you start the first ever world lab for flying pancake research. This is the kind of thing that we humans do, right? We get these ideas, sometimes a recombination of old things, and then we go from there. Well, let me give you an example of just how ingenious human minds are, even when it comes to the basics. So I already said, how do we come up with an idea like time travel? Well, it's not because some of us actually traveled to another time and then came back and said, oh, hey, let me tell you about this cool experience I had actually in the physical world. As far as we know, no one has done that. And yet it is a very common idea that we now all share. Well, here's a story about how an idea like that could come to be. In lots of languages around the world, people use spatial words to talk about time. So in English, we might say things like, we're coming up on the holidays. We're approaching the deadline. So we're talking about time as if it were a path that we can travel. And we're moving, in English, we're moving forward on that path from the past to the future. Well, once you have that metaphor in place, time is a path that you're traveling, that analogy, well, you can start asking questions about that analogy. You say, okay, well, time is a path I can travel. Well, paths I can travel in whatever direction I want and at any speed I want, right? So now you take that little analogy that happened in language, and then you can start extending it in your mind, and all of a sudden, here you have an idea that goes beyond physical reality. Now you can think about time in a way that you've never experienced it. Now you can think about moving forwards and backwards and so on. Now, when you look across the world's languages, the way that people talk about time is so richly diverse, right? So even something as basic as time has all of these different instantiations. So for example, I already told you in English, we put the future in front, the past is behind. So the best is ahead of us, the worst is behind us, things like that. There's some languages that do exactly the opposite. They put the past in front, they put the future behind. So the Aymara of Bolivia, for example, do this. For them, you might say, well, why would that be? That makes no sense. Well, for them, it makes perfect sense because the past is manifest. It's known. It's already happened. That's why you can see it. Whereas the future is unknown. That's why it's behind your head, right? So to them, it makes perfect sense to have the future not be visible. Some people put the past above and the future below. So for example, in Mandarin, the last month is the up month. The next month is the down month. English speakers like to organize time from left to right. That has to do with our direction of writing. But if you read and write Hebrew, Arabic, you're likely to organize time from right to left. So earlier things will be here, later things will be here. Some people don't organize time with respect to the body at all. So, for example, I had a chance to work in a community. This is an Aboriginal community in Australia. And instead of using words like left and right to organize space, they just use words like north, south, east, and west for everything, right? So in languages like this, sometimes even body parts are described with cardinal directions. So you would say things like, oh, there's an ant on your southwest leg, right? So imagine doing the hokey pokey in a language like that. You have to get oriented pretty fast. So just so we get a sense of how different a way that is of thinking about space than what we have now, can I ask you all to close your eyes and point southeast. No cheating. Okay, so if you open your eyes, I see points there, 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 there. Okay, you can settle this afterwards, but you've pointed in every possible direction, so someone is right. Someone is definitely correct. Just don't feel bad. This is a very common phenomenon. If I ask people in the Western world, roughly speaking, this is the kind of answer I get. But there are places like this community in Pomperal where you can stand next to a 5-year-old and ask, "Can you point southeast?" And she'll point immediately without hesitation. And you know, if you ask an adult, it's kind of insulting, almost like if I asked you, "Do you know which way is up?" You'd be like, "I don't even know what you're asking," right? Like, of course I know which way is up, and that's how people there feel like. Of course I know which way is south or north. It's obvious, right? Well, people who organize space that way in their minds, who are oriented in cardinal directions, also end up organizing time that way in cardinal directions. So for example, if I give someone a set of cards, like pictures of my grandfather at different ages, and I shuffle them and I say, "Can you just lay these out in the correct order on the ground?" If I ask an English speaker, American English speaker to do it, organize it from left to right, according to writing direction. Hebrew speaker will do it from right to left a lot of the time. These Kuuk-Thaayorre speakers organized it from east to west. So if they're sitting facing south, they would do it from left to right. If they're sitting facing north, they do it from right to left. If they're sitting facing east, they'll do it coming towards the body. So for them, time is laid out on the landscape. Now, when I first saw this defied my imagination. I could not have imagined that people in the world would be doing that, right? It's incredible. I tested so many people and how they think about time everywhere around the world. And I was just like, I can't believe I'm seeing this. And to me, when I see that kind of variation, when I see that kind of diversity around the world, it's such an incredible testament to the flexibility and the ingenuity of the human mind, right? Even when it comes to these very basic things, how you lay out time, how you think about space, how you think about causality, when you look around the world, humans have come up not just with one way of thinking about reality, not one way of constructing reality, but thousands and thousands, right? There are about 7,000 languages. Each one has its own constructed reality that people inhabit. And of course, languages are living things. They're not static things. These are tools that we change, we hone to suit our needs. We're constantly changing our languages, pushing them in different directions. And so that to me is also an incredible invitation to think about what are the new thoughts that we want to create in the languages that we speak? What are the new ways that we want to talk and think and spread to other people around us? So that's what I want to leave you with, thinking about what else is possible given the incredibly flexible tools that you have already in your mind. Thank you.
Quick question for Dr. Boroditsky.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. So I have a question. I read the book Sapiens by Aloha Raji a while back, and he talks about how we humans are different than all the other animals because of our imagination. But So I'll just quickly tell, like, he came up with 3 different revolutions in human history. One of them was the cognitive revolution, right? So what are your thoughts on this, and why can humans are the only ones who can do this and not other animals? But dogs can also imagine to a certain extent, but not like so wildly like us. So if you have any thoughts.
There's been a huge amount of research and thinking about what makes humans special. And I think it's one of the things we really like researching, because already we've flattered ourselves even with the question. We're like, why are we so awesome? Explain, right? And, you know, just about any simple individual answer you come up with, like, you might say, well, maybe it's tool use, or maybe it's language, or maybe it's the ability to combine symbols, or maybe it's the ability to abstract beyond perceptual similarity. I mean, people have come up with an infinite set of hypotheses. And just about any one of them that you push on very, very hard, you can find some example in some animal species where they do something like that, right? But it's not exactly like it, and it's just not as impressive as what humans do. Like with language, you know, anyone who has a dog says, well, my dog understands language, my dog is very smart, and my dog is very imaginative, and my dog is, you know, all of these things, and my dog understands emotion, and but there's no dog. Bertrand Russell had this wonderful quote that said, a dog will never say, my parents were honest though poor. Right. That's a kind of sentiment that you only get from humans. And bees will do these fabulous dances where they report in 3 dimensions where the nectar is, and they'll shake their butt and tell the other bees where to go. But that's all the bees ever talk about. They never chew the fat, right? They never say, you know, what do you think would happen if? So again, whenever you look at any one dimension, there's just like a sense in which humans are beyond. You can find little bits of it in other species throughout history, throughout the animal kingdom, but there's this there's a combination of a lot of things, including our ability to learn from each other and our ability to build socially and culturally ratchet, that is so special about humans. So if you think about anything in this room, not a single person here knows how any one thing in here was actually made and has all of the knowledge to reconstruct something in here from scratch, right? Everything in here is a product of thousands of years and millions of people working together and fine-tuning things. So I think that in combination with all the other things is what makes people special.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Oh, by the way, so who looked it up on Google Maps? Which way is southeast? It's that way, but okay. Anyway, carrying on, the great breadth of possibilities that we have here. So from the Department of Psychology here at UCSD, I have Dr. Adina Schachner, who's interested in the development of the mind and the development of imagination. And so we'll let her talk to us about that.
And here we are. All right, excellent. I'm so excited to be here as well. Very excited about this topic of what is imagination. And I'm here as a representative of the field of cognitive development, developmental psychology, cognition more broadly. Broadly, if you're wondering kind of what domains you might want to ask me about, as opposed to all the other expert, amazing people here, my lab mostly focuses on 2 domains that I see as related, and both are related to imagination. One I'll talk mostly about, that's about how we think about other people, how we actually simulate other minds and reason about what other people might think and know and believe. And the other thing that I think is related, but many other people take as quite disparate, is actually how we create and reason about music. So I am what you might call a music scientist, and I think that there are many questions about how we perceive music, how music evokes imagination, how music evokes episodic memories, that really will be incredibly interesting to talk about, but I won't be able to focus on everything here. But let's get started. So one of the things that my lab focuses on is this problem of what I like to call intuitive social reasoning. And so the problem is this. It's that as we move around in the world, there are certain things that are concrete. There are certain things we can see and feel and touch. There are things like people reaching for certain objects. We can track their movement in space. The different objects that Lira was talking about, we can interact with things that people created, with things in nature that are physical, that we can feel the properties of. And we can even hear sounds, including sounds that are made by people, things like music. The challenge here, and kind of the computational challenge for people in AI, is how do we get from these directly observable properties to make inferences about things that we could never directly observe? Things like what's going on inside somebody's head. How do we reason about somebody's goals, somebody's preferences, somebody's beliefs? These are things that come incredibly naturally to us, to most of us, not all of us. They're things that we spend most of our day actually reasoning about, what's going on inside somebody's head, but we can't get AI to do it, and we certainly can't get them to learn it themselves. And it's actually a common problem in AI right now. How do you get a self-driving car to actually figure out whether a pedestrian is going to walk off of a curb? This is a basic problem in cognitive social cognition. So the question here is, how do we do this? And how do we do this so easily? And of course, my answer here, as you might have imagined from this symposium, is we really, really need imagination. So I'm going to take a much broader sense of what imagination is. So why do we need imagination to do that? Really, imagination, I'm going to argue, is kind of the core of cognition. It's the core of everything we do as thinkers. We have the capacity to mentally transcend our circumstances. So there are certain things that we can directly observe. We can go beyond that. And in particular, Lira used this phrase, what would happen if, right? That is the core of what I consider thinking and reasoning. It's this capacity to think about possible worlds, to consider the possibilities of the past, of the present day, and also point ourselves towards the future. And so from developmental psych and cognitive psych, this really seems to be kind of the core of human cognition, allowing us to think about what might be, and even to think about the past. It turns out that researchers studying how memory works are now pretty sure that it works a lot like how we construct the future. We also construct our past. We're putting together different ideas of what we think might happen, pulling it together. Our memory is not really like a video camera. It's not that accurate and precise. It's quite accurate in some ways, but it's that same constructive versus prospective process that involves this kind of thinking. And particularly thinking and reasoning is something that really requires us to think about counterfactuals, to think about what would happen if. And so let me tell you a little bit about first something that we think about in my lab that I think pulls in some of these ideas. And then I'll broaden out a little bit to the field of developmental psychology and tell you some of the insights from there. So first of all, in my lab, we spend a lot of time thinking about design. And imagination is really, like Lira said, the core of how we construct all the objects around us. And one of the things that really does make us, that people like Joe Henrich and others have argued really does make us unique as a species, is our ability to build on the designs of others, to ratchet up in our ideas. So imagination is the core of what lets us take a problem and build a tool to solve it. And even have aesthetic qualities in art and music, that we're designing things that don't serve a particular instrumental purpose, but we're still perhaps serving aesthetic purposes in designing specific features. So in my lab, we're really interested in this process of reasoning about others' designs. So it turns out that as we move around in the world, we are surrounded by stuff, right? We are always surrounded by objects. And what we found in my lab is that we are capable of doing what I like to call intuitive archaeology. So the analogy here is that just like an archaeologist pulls an object out of the ground, and then instead of thinking about its physical features, she actually goes beyond what it's feeling like and what it's shaped like to ask this question: what does this actually tell me about people? What does this tell me about the people who owned this object, the people who created this object? This is an inference that really takes a physical thing and makes that physical thing into a social thing, something that carries really rich social information. So how do we actually do this? Well, we're using our imagination to actually leap beyond what we see to connect it to all sorts of other rich things. So what we find is that people are using this cognitive process of reasoning about the generative process behind objects. So when we see things that people own, we are reasoning about who they are based on making inferences about how did they get that thing? What would lead them to choose that thing? How did that actually come to be in their possession? Or why did they create it that way? And we've particularly focused on this case of how we detect plagiarism, because this is a case where you might think that people are doing something that's not imaginative at all. In particular, like, what makes you think that something is plagiarized? Well, is it identical or not? Is it similar? And so we asked this question with kids and with adults. When people are detecting copying, are they just looking at the similarity of two things, which would be, a relatively good heuristic, but not very imaginative at all, not very cognitively rich? And it turns out that what people are doing are actually not just reasoning about kind of how similar two things look, but going way beyond that to reason about the possible things that could have been made. And whether their choices were constrained. So in particular, if two people build the same thing, but they were solving the same problem, there was one obvious answer, and they both had only the resources to build that thing, well, now similarity is not good evidence that they actually plagiarized each other. There's an alternative explanation. And so what kids in our experiments are doing, and what adults are doing as well, is counterfactually reasoning about what would happen if. What would happen if you only had these materials to build with? Well, now everybody's going to end up building the same thing. So it would be really dumb for me to accuse you of plagiarism because this world was constrained. And so in our experiments, we build computational models of how this reasoning works, using kind of Bayesian models to look at kind of optimal inferences. And then we test them with kids, we test them with adults to see kind of how rich their reasoning is and how much it goes beyond the perceptual qualities of what they see. So I want to move on to what the field of cognitive development has to say a little bit about imagination per se, because young children, I'm saying, can do this. And the field has really focused on the capacities of young children to be creative, to be imaginative, and to engage in fantasy. And there are some really fundamental fun questions there, which means, of course, that I should start with a fun video of a child doing something cute. So here we go. So here's a video courtesy of Marjorie Taylor of a child describing her imaginary friends. And we'll hope the audio will work.
Okay. Well, how old is Elfie Wealthy? 1. Okay. So she's still a baby. Okay. Sammy's 2. Really? Okay. Is Sammy a pretend friend too? Yeah. Well, how big is Elfie Wealthy? Well, what does Elfie Wealthy look like? She has blonde hair. Okay. And she has butterfly clips in her hair. Sort of tie-dye hair. Cool. And tie-dye skin. Everything in Garlic Land is tie-dye. Yeah. Okay. That's everything arranged.
So everything in Garlic Land is tie-dyed, yes. So anyone who has recently spent time around young children or spent time around young children in any point in their life remembers this type of phase, right? Where it seems like they're engaged in this amazing fantasy world that takes over whenever they're engaged in play. I have a 3.5-year-old daughter who will sit down on the carpet in the living room and say, "We're fishing." And I'll say, "Oh, really? Okay." And then the pretense will build and build and build into this really complicated fantasy universe that she's building. But this is a really interesting view of what it is to be a child. Is it to be so engrossed in a fantasy world that you lose reality? And this is actually a claim that has been pervasive in developmental psychology, the idea that young children actually live in a world where fantasy and reality are intertwined. And the really core question here is, can children tell apart fantasy from reality? Imagination is very different from belief in the things you're imagining. Can they actually tell those apart? And so I want to give you a couple data points on this. So first is a kind of crucial study by Jackie Woolley and Phelps from the early 90s. And what they did was they set up this really nicely controlled experiment where they had a child sit down And they had 3 boxes, and one of the boxes had a pencil in the box, for example. The second box was in fact empty, and the child was looking in each box. They said, okay, box 1 has a pencil, box 2 is empty. And then they were instructed to imagine that box 3 had a pencil in it when they saw that it was in fact empty. So now you have a contrast between an imaginary pencil and a real pencil. And the question is, do children know that these 2 boxes are different in their contents? And so they have 2 different measures here that are really interesting that they pull apart. So the first thing is they ask children age 3 through 5, is there a pencil in box 3? And remember, that's the one where they just imagined that there was a pencil. And what's interesting here is that particularly at age 3, children are really happy to play along. So many, many children will say, yeah, there's a pencil where I imagined that there was a pencil. Now there's a pencil there, yes. But then what they do is they try to get rid of what we call demand effects. They have a new person come in that was not involved in that whole situation, and they just casually ask, oh, hey, can you give me a pencil? Right? So now the question is, will children say that there's a real pencil that the imaginary pencil is real, but actually act like they truly know that that is pretend? And that is what they find. So even 3-year-olds who say that that imaginary pencil is really there will then act as if they are fully knowledgeable that the fantasy world is distinct from reality. And further studies by people like Paul Bloom and colleagues of Paul Bloom and Skolnick and Bloom have shown that people are actually really good by about age 4 in even telling apart fantasy worlds. So the title of this study that's cited there is, Does Batman Know SpongeBob? So what they're actually asking children is not just, can you bump into Batman on the street? No, Batman is not real. But actually, can you dissociate that the characters in Lord of the Rings do not know the people in SpongeBob? They do not know the people in Superman and Spider-Man. The Marvel and other universes are separate. And it turns out that by age 4, children are very, very savvy to this. So a very different picture of what it means to be a child. So let's come back to imaginary friends really quick. What about imaginary friends? This is interesting because historically, this was thought to be sort of pathological. So if you saw this video and you were a clinical psychiatrist, people 50 years ago might have had the intuition that this child was disturbed. But what we now know from empirical research is that, no, it's actually exactly the opposite. Having imaginary friends is a good predictor of good things. In particular, it's pretty common. Many kids actually report having imaginary friends. And the ones who have really rich imaginary friends are actually the kids who watch the least television. That's not a shock. But later, they also are the kids who have greater theory of mind skills, so greater ability to think about other people's minds and simulate kind of what they're thinking and feeling. And it's also correlated with high verbal skill. So all indications are imaginary friends are actually a sign of, highly functional, good development, optimal development. And so kind of putting this all together, developmental psychology and imagination are now friends, whereas before perhaps they were not so much. So I want to leave us on one meta-scientific note. So I like to think a lot about meta-science, how we engage in the process of actually doing science. And imagination is really also at the core there. And there's some kind of sense that people often say that imagination is involved in science, and that's true. Science is creative. Science involves combining new ideas and involves coming up with new ideas. That's true. That's not just what I want to say. In order to do science, you actually have to do 2 hard things. The first one is hard on its own. You have to come up with a hypothesis. You have to come up with an idea of how you think the world works. But what we actually have to do as scientists to do good science is go beyond that. And that's, I think, the part where imagination is really makes it quite hard. We have to imagine alternative universes, alternative hypotheses. And then we have to actually tease them apart. So we have to know not only, oh, I'm going to design an experiment that will produce my predicted result, but we also have to know that it's not the case that everything would produce that predicted result, because that wouldn't be very informative. So in order to really know that our hypothesis is true, we have to be able to tell apart what would happen in the world if instead of my hypothesis, something else was actually the way that things really work. And we have to simulate and imagine the predictions of all of these different worlds. The hypothesized world, the alternative hypothesized world, what does each one predict? So really, science is this very, very hard counterfactual reasoning problem that involves not just the creativity of coming up with an idea, but then the imagination of imagining how that idea might be wrong and how specifically the wrongness, the wrong version of it might lead you to different results. So I'll leave you with that. So thank you so much for having me here. And I'll thank my funders and my lab as well. So thanks.
Thanks so much. Okay, so I have a quick question for you. They pay you good money to do this stuff, right? Like you have fun?
They pay me good money and I have fun.
Yes, and no, it's just like way too much fun to have looking at that. So is anybody over here have a question for Dr. Schachner?
Thank you for that. I think they have to redo that study now that all the Marvel and DC universes are mashed up with all the TV shows, because that's more common now, right? There's no. But I wanted to ask you, is music a ability that is innate, learned, and how does that differ in people? So can most people imagine music if they've heard it or never heard it, or if they've heard it, can they then make up new music? I mean, have you studied that, and as it relates to these other modalities? Yeah. Because there's evidence that there's a completely separate neuro process for that.
Yeah, that's a very rich question with a lot of interesting things I could say. So you started with the question, is music innate itself? You know, I could point you to several fascinating books. So as a developmental psychologist, I'll start there. Musicality. So I want to distinguish music from musicality. So music is the stuff we make. It's the product, and it's really culturally diverse. It changes over cultural time. Musicality is the capacity we have in our brains to engage with that music, to perceive it, to enjoy it, to feel motivated to do it at all. And musicality, there is much evidence that this is cross-culturally universal, present in every culture, as is music, as is dance, and extremely early developing. So one of the things about studying infants or working with infants or having an infant is you suddenly notice that they are extraordinarily sensitive to song, to musical speech, to musicality in any domain. So the evidence from developmental psych suggests that musicality is present at birth in many cases in terms of perception. One of the current arguments is about music production. Production of musical behavior. One thing my lab is studying is the development of dance behavior, which it turns out is a lot easier for babies to do than, say, singing behavior. And it turns out that we're finding evidence that pretty much as soon as infants can move their bodies at all, they are responding to music with movement and producing behavior that has a lot of different behavioral signatures of dance. And so I would be on the side of many of the things about music are, there's evidence cross-culturally, there's evidence of developmentally of perhaps innateness, at least extreme early development. There were many other components of what you said, but I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
So broadening our horizons a little bit further, I'm super pleased to have our friend Clinton Tolley from the philosophy department, and who has an interdisciplinary program with cognitive science and with German and Latin studies. And so bringing us the sort of social cultural view of imagination. And so please welcome Dr. Tolley.
I think so. Yeah, Patrick was helping me. Let's see if I can figure it out. Yes. Okay. Great. This way, and then if I'm right, yeah. Will it do? Oh yeah. And then how can I use slideshow? Yeah. Yep. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for the Clarke Center for hosting. Oh, will this pause? Let's actually get out of that and do full screen. I apologize. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to race through some highlights from the history of philosophy and philosophical psychology. Back a long time ago, psychology was thought of as a branch of philosophy, the part that gave the logic or science of the soul, or psyche. We'll start with Aristotle. But I wanted to, just give you a sense and nourish your own imaginations for thinking beyond what we think right now about the imagination. So be imaginative about the imagination. You can see it's getting very philosophical already. What has been said about what the imagination is? What does it do? What is it good for? And also, where does it come from? So this was coming up a little bit in the previous presentations. Just, maybe refresh some of you who have maybe not thought about the history of the development of thinking about the imagination for a while. Here's some at least information that you can then start letting sink into you. So so we'll start with the Greeks, Aristotle. In a way, we can see, so this is, I'm not sure why. Let's see, can I do that? Oh, no. Yeah. I haven't really used this one before. Let's see if I can make this be, is there a, let's see. Oh, all right. I don't know how to make them show up as full size, so I apologize for that. That's too bad. We'll go ahead and do this again. So the little thing on the right says de anima, which is important, and I think it shows up here at the top of the left. So one of Aristotle's most famous works is called De Anima, which is the Latin translation of perisuke, which is on the soul. And so suke, soul, anima is where we derive the name psychology. And in Aristotle's work way back then, he too was thinking about a lot of these fundamental questions about the powers of our mind, or the soul, as it was called then, or psyche, the psychic powers, and how do we differentiate them? Are there principles for differentiation? And one of the key things that he had already set about through experimentation, introspection, was that there seems to be, as Eric was bringing up even in the intro, an important distinction between sensing or having sense perception, imagining, and a third thing, which is reasoning or thinking or conceiving in some more abstract sense. You can see in this boxed out part, him saying imagination is different from both perceiving and also reasoning. Maybe it needs to have perception to get it going, to give it some material. And this interesting claim too, I think this was coming up too also in a previous presentation about current findings, maybe thinking, abstract, conceiving can't get going unless not just seeing happens, but also imagining. So it seems like it's an intermediate developmental thing on the way to having abstract powers of reasoning. But crucially, I wanted to note so imagination comes from Latin. I'm sure you all could tell me that etymology, imaginatio, and then the root word is imago, which now if I just change the last letter, it's image. The Greek word is Fantasia or Fantasia, and the things that it relates to that helps give it that root in Greek will be phantasmas. So if we're thinking about what is this thing that is imagining, or imagination, it's the kind of the happening or bringing about of images or fantasy happening or phantasmas happening. What is that, and where does it come from, and what is it good for? So another work that he looks at these powers is in the powers of animals. So that's also something that was coming up before. There is this question, it seems like, of course, animals can sense. Maybe, as Lira was bringing up, everything we point to, they can kind of do. And he was very interested in that question too, that it seemed like there's continuity with with all kinds of beings, all kinds of animals, that they must be able to do this thing that goes beyond mere taking in sense perceptions, but do this projecting, having maps that they respond to. If you have pets, they twitch in their sleep and have dreams too. Maybe they don't get to reason about it, or who knows, the Bertrand Russell quote, that's a nice one. But there's something going on that's beyond mere just takings in of sensory data. So what is that like? Aristotle was already onto that too. Now, as we move out of that period, it is worth noting that there is this other tradition that emerges in the history of philosophy and also technically philosophical psychology as Christianity emerges on the scene out of the European side of things. And so there is a doctrine, I just want to bring this out there just because it maybe nourishes your imagination in a different direction. The idea that creation is creation, obviously, that existence is creation, but that there's an image relation between creation and the divine. And so if any of you were brought up in Christian circles, Catholic circles, there's a famous doctrine of imago Dei, that humans in particular, or rational beings, are especially good images of the divine. They're not identical, of course, and they don't let you sense the divine, but they stand in some interesting imaging relation. And so we could ask, is there a divine imaginatio that's like making images happen, and we're those? Okay, that might seem very cosmic. The small thing, these little side ones are funny that they're so small, but Plato, way back, actually had a doctrine like this, that he thought there was this power demiurge, and it made the existent world as an image of this timeless eternity. And so actually existence is a kind of imago. That's just to make sure you got some cosmic things and not just psychological things. Anyways, but moving along, and this will be more quick, jumping ahead to David Hume had a bunch of studies of under different names, but the same kinds of concepts, not sensation, imagination, thinking, but sense, impression, imagination, and then ideas or thinking. So this is just to get us into English. You can see this on the right. Kant was a very influential expositor of the powers of the soul or the mind. He too thought there was an important distinction, you can see on the right, between sense, on the one hand, the low level, imagination as a next level, and then this thing he calls apperception, or something like attention, and that only after we have all that could we have real thinking or understanding. So again, just to give you a sense of both how far these thoughts go back, but also a kind of continuity of consensus to get some further thoughts going maybe in your head. Now, he thinks this is just a fundamental part of anthropology, that we have this kind of power. But he too, and it's interesting, like Aristotle thinks, well, it's part of our soul or our mental powers that is really continuous with the animals. Now, one thing that he does, which is interesting, and in some ways goes beyond Aristotle possibly, is to also try to connect this power of imagining, going beyond what we merely sense, and maybe be on the road to thinking about it and knowing things and having science and all those things that we were just hearing about, that it also goes in the direction of art in particular and our aesthetic experience, that we wouldn't have that either unless we could imagine that when we are having aesthetic experience, it's not just like the impingement of data on us in a kind of passive way. There's this active thing happening, our engagement with it. Maybe it's not all the way to thinking yet, but there's this spontaneous creative in us, not just in the person who made the artwork, but in us, imaginative living with it. That is what actually is giving us the pleasure, that it's not just like a zap, you saw blue, it's that you saw blue and then something else happens in your soul or your mind, and it's imagining. So that's also an interesting contribution to the philosophy of the imagination, that it would contribute not just to creative artistic production, but even aesthetic appreciation of artistic productions. The psychological proto-cognitive science direction was developed after Kant in an intense way by Hermann von Helmholtz, who did a bunch of studies on sensations, but given the tradition to define what this low level is in the soul or the mind, he had to also try to talk about how it's different from the next levels. And so he focuses on two circles of sensation, visual sensations with optics and auditory sensations with tone sensations. But crucially, he has to try to figure out, where does that end and where does imagination begin? And so it's a very also interesting doctrine that has as a consequence, there's a kind of imagination and whole sets of images that go along with all 5 sense modalities. And maybe there's an intermediately common image that synthesizes all of those together. And this is all happening before we're really thinking or conscious or aware. So all of these things which we know and love from our colleagues down the street were already being dug up and had kind of had the ground prepared for them by some of this earlier work. So what we're hoping tonight is, what are we preparing the ground for that will go beyond all this? I just want to also note one person who was a professor of both philosophy and psychology and the president of both the American Philosophical Association and the American Psychological Association, Mary Winton Calkins, gives a nice little chart. This is turn of the century. What was going on and how do we think about these relationships? There's what is the image, what is imagination? Well, it comes out of the senses, but then there's simple versions, there's complex versions, there's ones that have to do with people, there's ones that have to do with art, there's ones that have to do with, interestingly, verbal, which is a nice tie into the things that Lira was talking about in particular. Where does this come from, though? Where does this power come from? We know it's in our soul or in our mind or something. One key clue, at least that some people were following out, you could already see it in Helmholtz's title, Physiological Optics, is that it's not just kind of esoterically there in some disembodied mind, but maybe there is something about our very bodies that have the imagination power that let us anticipate, go beyond, aren't just mere reactionary things, but actually can be productive and creative on their own right. So Descartes, though he's not always thought about this, and then a later French philosopher, Merleau-Ponty, have these views of the imagination as having bodily roots, which is an interesting direction. Now, oh, sorry. So you can't see the little one, but that's the dream interpretation of dreams from Freud. We can think, okay, yeah, so what is it good for? What is it making? Well, we've already thought that maybe it has to go beyond sensation and isn't yet thinking, but it does all kinds of things in that tier of our mental lives. There's, when we have a control over it, that might be an interesting direction. Investigations, though, at the turn of the century were intensely interested in when we don't really have control over it, or we seem to, but we pretend like we don't, or all the different dynamics. Is the imagination something that's kind of a wild thing underneath us? Is it a dark art, or could we kind of train it or come to know its logic? Not just if you show this, then you'll anticipate this color, but deeper things about categories of meaning, maybe even religious symbolism. And then this large one, unfortunately, is the larger one. Does it happen at group levels too? So not just do I have this power, but when we get together, does something like imagining happen that could only happen when there's two of us in the sense of mass psychology? Now, it's probably most famously associated with Jung, another philosophical psychologist from the period. So this archetypes and the collective unconscious, the very idea of imagination has already been kind of slotted as having a foothold below thinking and consciousness. One of the developments in this direction is that this is happening at a group level unconsciously too, not just in the conscious moments. So where could that take us as we think further along those lines too? Now, again, biologically, psychologically, and the deeper roots of our, kind of corners of our psychical developments in the Freudian sense, what else causes the imagination? What else gets it going and gives its forces? So on the left side, we see the famous work by Marx and Engels, a characterization of a certain happening in mental life as specifically ideology, but crucially, it is powered and generated by something that they call the imagination. And the transition from mere sensing and perceiving to eventually thinking goes through that kind of power. But there's a massive input into that power, which is social dynamics, economic dynamics. Could that even be at the root of what we think of as my imagination or your imagination or even our imagination collectively? Now, Adorno is a later development of that. We don't have time to talk too much about it. I just wanted to mention Marcuse on the left, because he's actually here in the late 60s, early 70s, who had a very optimistic view of imagination, not just in the individual, not just in the levels of like actually seeing or thinking rather than sensing, and not just collectively something happening or the dark things, but creatively, that could this power open up social vistas and let us do things together, not just think new things, but actually visualize in a concrete way to lead our action, to guide it forward, and transform the current reality through a concrete image that then would give us guidance on what we should do next. Now, I wanted to juxtapose it with this Mexican philosopher, Jose Vasconcelos, who also has a lot of these themes in his writings, in part because, and I'm now horrified by what the images, oh no, okay, they showed up. What could group imagining be like? Maybe there's the dark ones, or we don't know, we don't want to talk about them. But when we try to take control over them and try to do them together, what kinds of things can they accomplish? Well, they can accomplish all kinds of things like science and art in a general sense, but could they accomplish even a still further thing of allowing us to finally present ourselves to ourselves, to finally come to know ourselves and come to in some ways, see ourselves. Now you can think, how do you see groups? Some of this was coming up before. How could we see us? How could we see our community? How could we see, in that sense, we can't really sense perceive. We can think about it, but what if there was this intermediate thing that we could do? Wouldn't that be compelling and actually powerful to help guide our action, to help give us cues into what we were in the first place? Could the power of collective imagination to present ourselves to ourselves through things like this is Vasconcelos's sponsored mural that Diego Rivera did in Mexico City, could that give us some insight into who we are through our imagination? Other people's taking on the same task, and then us far on the left, our own UCSD mural, making use of the imagination. So hopefully you'll now have, or we will all have, some powers to go forward and imagine better and more. Thanks.
Oh, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. A quick question for Dr. Tolley while we get the our other colleagues up to sit up for a few minutes at the table. Any question for Clinton?
Thank you. The California Department of Education is putting out a model curriculum for ethnic studies. The first draft was too offensive and has been set aside. The same group is rewriting it. Are you involved in that, or do you know anything about the ethnic studies model curriculum?
Personally, but I have heard some things about it. So, I mean, the very idea of an ethnos, or a people, is a very interesting category, and we have a lot of reasoning about it, and there's been some scientific research about to what extent do they exist, and what kinds of objects are they people. One thing that I think is interesting about the direction through the imagination is, are there ways in which we can coordinate with that concept, not just in general, but specific cases of it, visual, concrete, in that sense perceptible, but not really perceived in the sense that they're just waiting out there, we have to make them, but that do some kind of imaging of what it is to be that kind of a person or people collectively. So one thing, I'm not sure what direction they're going with the actual curriculum, but it does seem like at least the spirit of, especially Clarke Center type projects, would be that a core component of coming to a self-identity would be trying to use your imagination collectively to image yourself in that way. And what would that look like? So yeah, I think it's a nice connection. Thanks.
Well, thanks everybody for persisting through this. Amazing people with fantastic ideas. Since I'm the director, I get to ask some of the first questions, but we'll take a few more questions from the audience. Some of the questions I thought of have been addressed already, such as do animals have imagination? Now, I've had the good fortune to talk to world experts on machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I'm going to pose it to my colleagues here. Do they think that machines could ever be supposed to have imagination, and what might that look like? Are those cat pictures that we see from Google, is that really imagination? Anybody got an answer for us?
I'm happy to try to answer. Certainly, machines create things that humans perceive as creative, right? So there are machine-written pieces of music. There are machine-generated jokes that humans find funny. You know, in just about any genre of creative endeavor, you can get an artificial intelligence system to generate something new out of old elements, to recombine it in some way that appears both intentional and interesting and new. So if we think the product is evidence of an imagination, great, then you would say yes. If you think the internal mechanism that generates that product is the imagination, then you would also have to say yes. It might feel very different from the way that it feels in, you know, the qualitative experience might be extremely different, but depending on how you define it.
So maybe sort of a Turing test for imagination, you know, what would that look like?
So there's a really great article in, I think it's Aeon, written by Michael Graziano a couple years back, where Graziano put forth an idea on a test for, he has a view of what consciousness might be, and it basically, it's alarmingly simple, so you'd hate it. but it's this idea that we have these internal models of our own movement, right? That actually help us to understand when we move in the real world, there are actions that happen, and we have a prediction of what that's going to be like, and we adjust our own internal model to make sense of the world around us if for some reason that expectation was different. So Graziano's idea is that consciousness is actually an internal model of our own state of attention. And I like that to reflect back on what Lira said, because I actually would say that a machine does not have imagination unless it could reflect on its own production. Like, I think that's key to me to what imagination is, that you are actually self-reflecting.
Fair enough.
I was going to add to that a little bit.
I got a good question there going.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, it starts me off by thinking of kind of a short story that people read in like introductory cognitive science, which is like The Mind is Made of Meat. And it features a bunch of aliens talking about a newly discovered species, and they're shocked that the mind is made of meat, because how could meat think? How could meat compute? How could meat reason? And it turns out at the end of the story, they're all machines. So at its conceptual basis, yeah, maybe our machines can't think, but if we are really taking seriously the idea that the brain is a machine, it's just wetware as opposed to dry hardware of circuit boards, at its extremes, yeah, of course, it should be, of course, but it's not yet. I think we should take into account the process here. So some of the things that I think that you were referring to, Lira, have to do with this kind of deep learning type of process that has taken hold in a lot of cognitive science and AI, where you basically, everything is bottom up. You throw a whole bunch of data at a program and it groups it and it figures it out and it comes to some conclusion. But the process that it's using to get there is probably very different from what the human mind does. And I would contrast that with something that I mentioned called Bayesian reasoning, which tries to at least conceptually get at this process of like comparing explanations and figuring out which one is right based on which one is the best fit for the evidence you have. And so people are building models of the mind based on that sort of reasoning process, that if you take it seriously as a model of what the mind actually is doing, it might get you to imagination. It might, because it's a lot of things that sort of tie into what you're saying of, you have a model for planning your behavior, and then you can actually flip it and say, okay, I know how I would solve that problem. And now if I imagine that you're rational like me, I can use my mental model of planning to make inferences about other people. And so that's the kind of Bayesian model that I think is fun, because it's maybe getting us to imagination, and maybe AI will use it to answer your question at some point.
I can wait if you want to get to another one.
Can I follow up for a
Go
second?
ahead.
So I'm always curious about this question about the process. So like the process that a machine does it as opposed to the human mind, especially when it comes to imagination, because it seems extremely unlikely to me that there is one process that the human mind goes through for imagination. And even at the beginning, you started by giving us this example of people imagining in very different ways, either algorithmically or imagistically. And so the gold standard being to do it the way the human mind does it, I think is a strange gold standard, because there's so many different ways that my mind probably does it differently than your mind, and there are going to be lots of differences. So I think it's the reason it's such a wonderful and engaging question is that it makes us really think about what is imagination, and what do we consider to be the human imagination to be emulated or bested by other intelligences.
Very good. Okay, so we'll changing gears here a little bit. So we actually have an example of this. Here at UCSD, we have the new Danny Sanford Institute for Compassion and Empathy, which Mr. Sanford was so generous in funding at the level of $100 million here at UCSD. It's a fantastic donation and a major accomplishment for our people at the university. So I'm going to say, well, if we were to talk to Mr. Sanford and say, well, we don't even need $100 million. If I had $10 million, what could I do? What would be the imagination study that you would do if you had $10 million or any unlimited amount of money? Anybody gotta answer? Clinton, you said you were anxious to answer this question, so we'll start with you.
Well, we did get a preview of some of these in an email, and I thought that one was really nice. Just it's wonderful to think about having that kind of resource. But I mean, personally, I mean, there's of course different kinds of studies about, especially the cognitive, perceptual, imaginative processing, how many different routes they might take. I guess I would be interested, and it sounds like also just in the name of the center, empathy and compassion, so that if it did go in a kind of social collective imagination direction, that we could try to develop ways to identify, articulate, codify social collective imaginative processes to have there be not just when I see another something out there as like me, but when I, with us, see someone or something as one of us in a kind of broader way than just me, you, but we, also we maybe. I think those kinds of dynamics and forms of imagination are ones that we get in different kinds of art and especially maybe in film, but we don't have a lot of categories for them, but they do, especially right now, you know, as soon as we walk out of this room, we're confronted with so many social and political questions, working out powers of imagination that could not just enliven empathy and compassion, but really make them charged to do good, not just one-on-one, but for us all. That would be amazing. So I'm sure it would take at least $10 million.
I was going to say at least $10 million. So all right, so we need 10 to 20 for that one. And so Lira, Dina, Leanne, what's your dream experiment? What's your grand theme that you'd pursue?
Wow. I'm actually going to be a team player here because we've already written a great experiment, and it actually focuses very much on neurotechnology, which I'm fascinated by. I also am very passionate about individual differences, as is probably was obvious from what I shared. So given that you talked about Fantasia and everybody has a same core set of mental functions that they put together differently in their building blocks that interact differently with the environment and their past experience, we, as Lira said, all imagine things differently. How can we characterize that? That is the $10 million question. And we're getting closer with the tools of neuroscience, right? So if I were to ask you to hold that image that Eric asked you to imagine in your head, there are tools now with functional magnetic resonance imaging that allow me to get close to characterizing what is the nature of that image, like actually reconstruct it, believe it or not. And this whole field of visual imagery has been pushing in this direction for a while. So having that as a basis, we also could do some more behavioral studies, right? To push around if I have a quality, like you were saying, take a picture of the thing that you're imaging, but we have other ways that we think we could get a reconstruction of someone's imagined image, we can actually play games with, say, binocular rivalry, which is another neurotechnology tool, and have the image that you're holding in your mind compete with an image that I'm giving you. And we know from other studies that when things are close together, they will compete and change the way you perceive two things that are presented, so they won't alternate in the same way. So there are even behavioral ways where I could say, actually, this thing that I'm presenting to you must be very close to the thing that you're holding in your mind, or it's very different from that. So we're thinking that we can actually probe individuals, like what they're actually holding now in visual imagery. And so this is something, and Eric is a great fundraiser, so we're going to do it.
So at least 25 million for that one. Okay, all right. All right, Adina, what about you? What's your $10 million experiment?
Well, there's many different ones. I mean, $10 million is a wonderful amount. Not enough to solve the whole problem of how the brain and mind works. So we'll pick something pressing. So I want to kind of conceptualize the problem of fake news as a failure of imagination. So we have an issue now where people are being presented with a wealth of claims on social media, from the news, from various cable news stations, etc. And we're faced with this problem of how deeply should we think about or be skeptical of all the claims that we make, that we hear. And so in order to be correctly skeptical, you have to imagine the motivations of somebody in presenting you with various claims. And so you're cognitively deciding how much resources should I put into thinking really deeply and imagining the different motivations that might lead somebody to mislead me in this way or the other. And so I think one $10 million question is, A, what are the factors that make people able or have the spontaneous tendency to deeply engage skeptically with those kinds of news claims, those kinds of empirical claims about how the world works? How do we get people to think deeply about the motivations of others in presenting them with information in a way that would allow people to just do a better job of processing the world in a way that could help us make sense of it in the best way possible? So that's
I love it. I obviously, it has to get funded, yes. Lira, do you have one for us? Any ideas on what's your key experiment?
Well, I think that sometimes not having $10 million is a really good driver of imagination. Not that having $10 million
Just don't tell the
is a
empathy
bad thing.
people that one yet.
But I think you could definitely do a very good experiment to find out whether people imagine better with or without $10 million. And that would cost exactly $10 million.
Is that kind of like tenure? Is that
Let me give you a more serious answer. I think often there's tension in our culture and lots of other cultures because people feel like the things that they're used to are reality, are necessary reality, that it's the way that they have to be. So, for example, when we ever have a proposed language change, people want to add a pronoun or subtract a pronoun, any minimal change, there's going to be a lot of uproar and some people will be upset. And there's the sense that the right way to do it is the way that I am used to. And of course, language changes over time and so on. And so I would really want to understand what allows us to imagine things as being okay when they're different from what we're used to, right? So all of us have this tendency to want to feel comfortable around things that we grew up with, right? So the best predictor of what music you think is the best music is the music you listened to when you were 23 years old, right? And that's for the rest of your life, that'll be the best music. It's a little sad. There's a lot of other music that happens after you're 23 years old. And so taking that as an example, thinking about how we could become kinder, more inclusive, more flexible, more adaptive, by imagining how things could be rather than thinking about just the way that things are that we're used to.
That's great. We wouldn't even need money for that one, so maybe we can think.
Well, you
on
already
that.
spent the $10 million.
Well, there we go. That's right. That's right. All right. Well, we just have time for a couple of quick questions from the audience. Patrick has the microphone.
Several of you just gave me. The couple of things that the two ladies in the center commented on with the fake news and differences in people. Our daughter works in media in New York and is constantly telling us, I mean, we all know it, but how frightening it is what we're being presented with. And some of the things she shared with us is not only the information that's being presented, but how it's being presented, where they will show two people who appear to be having a conversation, but they're not. You know, it was taped, half of it was taped hours before, but it's being shown as a live conversation that they're having between two people. And I thought about, what is the effect on us physiologically? Somehow we know we're confused. We somehow know that this conversation isn't actually happening, but we're being shown that this conversation is happening. And I've wondered, is that adding to, you know, you hear about all the stress and whatever that people are experiencing from listening to this. Is it actually the information that's being presented, or is a part of that underlying you saying, this isn't happening, what's going on up here? Anyway, I didn't know if anybody's looking at that level of how all of this is kind of affecting us as people. Yeah. It's terrible.
No, it's a fantastic point. And I guess what I wanted to say as a neuroscientist is that the brain is constantly responding to contrast and differences, and that cognitive dissonance that comes up when you have this alert that there is something that's different or that's wrong does create a kind of stress, and we are very good at detecting it, but we're not necessarily good at putting a name to it. We're not necessarily good at saying, like, I know it's wrong because, you know, that looks photoshopped and right here I could tell. It just is this unsettling feeling, right? That's there. You have a lot more experience here than
I think that's a great point. The kind of just, I mean, from neuroscience, but also from psychology, we know that there's a lot that we're processing that we're not able to sort of put into words. And that kind of conflict of knowing that you're watching some news where there's some motivation that you don't quite understand. They're presenting you with information that you have an idea that it could be manipulated in some way or the other. It's going to be a constant cognitive load of trying to figure out what it is. And one response that is particularly, I think, common and also not very productive is the response that I have as well, is to just say, I don't know, I'm going to disengage. And so that's why I think this is a good $10 million question of like, how do you promote useful engagement that doesn't just mean that you're just soaking it all in and using yourself as a, getting beaten up by all of this cognitive load. So yeah, it's a hard problem.
Could I maybe play devil's advocate for a second? So when Don Quixote was published, some people describe it as the first novel, the first single author work of fiction. A lot of clerical leaders thought it was a horrible thing that there would be fiction, because fiction is lies. It's just something that one person made up and wrote down, and now everybody's head would be filled with lies. And they worried that this would rot people's brains, that people would not be able to tell truth from fiction, because truth from lies, because here was this book that was presenting this entirely fictive world. Of course, now we have a different attitude towards fiction. We force our children to read it, and we think it's developing their minds, to fill their minds with all of these lies that were generated by other people. But we have different things that we say are terrible, like video games, or what you can, the internet, all kinds of other things. So every generation comes up with different fictive kinds of experiences that we are to fear, because we think, oh, people won't be able to tell the difference between the real world and rap lyrics, or the real world and video games, or the real world and Don Quixote. And so I'm always encouraged at how flexible and powerful human minds are, and how we do sort things out, and how we do over time figure it out. There are, of course, these moments of tension in history where new things come about, but I think maybe there's more hopefulness there than we sometimes feel in this day.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Happy for the optimism.
Who's got the microphone?
Yeah, here. I want to know how unintentional forced imagination work inside our brain. Like when we have visual or auditory hallucinations, we know that it's not real. We don't feel it by our senses, but our brain tricks us to imagine it. Like, how does that happen?
I will totally defer to the brain scientists over here. But I want to connect the two questions, because I think it raises a really nice point that in general we should address at a center like this is the human imagination always doing good things? And is it everything that it does, should it be allowed to be done? Or do we want to tame it? Do we want to control it? Do we want to guide it? And what would guide it? Would it be more imagining? Or should there be, and this is the classical psychological picture that I was rushing you through in the past, that there are some other capacities that we have which aren't, strictly speaking, the imagination, although they partner with it and maybe work together with it, obviously sensing, but this other thing that would be thinking, reasoning, planning, projecting, where the guiding points aren't just more imagination, that there's something else that helps guide the imagination, which gives it its purpose and directiveness, and also allows it to be used for good rather than just whatever it wants, if it wants things. And I think hallucination is a great, or different kinds of mental phenomena, which you might think of as low-level psychological processing, which, how could they be bad? They're just another thing that happens in your mind. But as it gets downstream, and especially when it gets to the very imaginative use of media to do these really, what we might all collectively think, at least at the moment, although Lira might convince us otherwise, pretty terrible things. But it's totally the result of the imagination. And so how will we, from the small to the grand scale, rein it in or give it guidance? Will that just be more imagination? And so not that the center needs to take orders from somewhere else, but just that it might have partners also too.
All right, well, maybe I'll take this last question myself. And I'll approach it as a physician. And we were just describing this sense of disquiet and that things aren't right. And personally, through my training and through my clinical experience, I've seen people in the throes of psychosis. And what I can tell you from working and trying to help these people is that they're very upset. They're upset that their mind isn't working correctly, and they have a sense of that. And it's something that we, as their family, as their friends, as their clinicians, we try and validate that with them. And it's funny because it works both ways. It can work both in a depressive and upsetting and down point of view, but it can also be expressed as mania, which is actually, if you've ever been with somebody who's manic, it's actually kind of fun. They're just having a blast. And you have fun along with them. And in fact, clinically, we're trained to reflect in ourselves what we feel about what's happening with this person. And in fact, to me, that's almost in a sense of how we might, as a separate individual, evaluate whether somebody is manic. Their brain is on overdrive. They're going so fast. They still have a sense of disquiet. So going back to the point that I started off with, which is patients validating for me about thinking, because as I said, through things that we do in medicine, through disease, we see disruptions of the mind. And when those things can be cleared and they come back, and you see somebody who's clear thinking and emotionally stable again, and they're happy. And I'm just thinking of a patient that I saw a week ago who had had terrible depression because of chronic pain. And because of a new therapy, we were able to get her pain under control. And I saw a smile on her face for the first time in 3 years. That was incredibly validating. And so we have these internal senses of when our thinking is clear. And as I say, our friends and our health professionals help to bring somebody back to reality. And so the hallucinations and psychoses, as I say, are ultimately, even though they can be fun, and they often are very fun, being grounded back in reality is where people want to be and where they're happiest. So imagination is a fantastic thing, and I love this cross view from development to cognition to neurophysiology and social and historical. It's just been lovely to have all of you here. And so, as I said, here at the university, we're in a special place with so many fantastic colleagues and so many opportunities to work together. Our real wish is just to have enough time to talk to everybody. So thanks so much for everybody for coming, and keep an eye on our website. Now that you've all taken your pictures, I'm looking for social media postings. Since you've been asked to take pictures. And with that, I'll say good night. Thanks very much.